So today, what we're doing is for the first session, we're going to look at this idea of what can alternatives to public safety look like? How can we create a more safe and secure system for people with disabilities? That's mental and behavioral disabilities, that's physical disabilities, that's, other types of abilities across all disability spectrums. How can we create a system that's more accessible to them, and particularly amongst, people of color? And then the second session is going to be looking at how do we use data as a way to help inform the supports and services that people who come in contact with the legal system to use to better inform how we can develop and provide more effective services and supports to them, both within the system and outside of the system while they're in the community. Then as a part of the sort of integration of the CESA work, I wanted us to look at this sort of idea of, this big, huge mental and behavioral health workforce gap that's creating a sort of difficulty in the implementation process of our, CESA work. Then the last one, which I believe to be a very huge gap in our system, which is 24/7 community-based crisis support. Because right now, when a person with a mental or behavioral health disability goes through a crisis, most likely they're going to end up in two places: the hospital or jail. And neither one of them is effective nor efficient. The hospital puts a tremendous cost on the individual, and the jail puts a tremendous cost on society, and both produce a tremendous social cost that drives division between people's faith in the system and trust in the system, and thinking about, how we're going to do that. And at 12 o'clock, I'm going to provide the keynote address that kind of helps provide a sort of look at my family history, my experiences in the neighborhood, my experiences in different communities, and and the things that were necessary for not me to just understand, but me be able to develop the skills necessary to help communicate with other people who had never truly been exposed to people like myself, where if they were, they had misguided, beliefs about people with mental and behavioral health disabilities. So thank you once again for joining us today. And I'm so glad that you can join us. So I'm gonna hand it over to Jay to start the first panel on what can an alternative public safety system look like and how can we bring it to life? Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jay Jin Park, and I am very honored and pleased to be your moderator for this morning's first session, entitled All About Reimagining Public Safety and a Pathway Forward. Thank you to our panelists, Brianna Payton, Alexander Brown, and Obari Cartman. So for this conversation, we have some prepared questions that I'm going to ask our panelists, and please feel free to chime in with each other as we go along. So the first question is, how do you define public safety in your work? Who would like to jump in?
So for me, I think that when people often think about public safety, they define it in ways that are very reactive, like how are we responding to crime? How are we handling and diffusing emergencies and tragedies? But when I think about public safety, personally, I really think about communities that are thriving and where violence between and against people is simply not quotidian. It's not something that happens on a daily basis because communities and people individually have the resources and the support that they need to lead thriving lives where their contribution to society is one of health that reflects their gifts, their talents, rather than contributions that stem from brokenness and not having what you need. And so when I think about public safety, and I think another thing that's important about my definition of public safety is that it is inclusive of everyone, because, and I think that this will come up later in the panel, but I'm eager to bring it up now. A lot of times when people talk about public safety, I feel like they pit some groups against the other. So they have people that they criminalize in their minds or that they consider the threats to public safety. And then there's what do we do with them to protect public safety? And it's almost like people are in two different buckets. But when I think about public safety or community safety, as some people in the movement call it, it includes all of us, those of us that have been harmed, those of us that may have caused harm. How can we all heal and thrive together?
Thank you for that. And apologies, in my haste to jump into the content, I forgot to ask if for our panelists to do just a very short intro of yourselves and a little bit about your background. If you so, Brandon, if you can follow with just a quick intro.
Gladly. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brianna Payton. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am originally from Detroit, Michigan. I went to Princeton University for undergrad, where I studied sociology and minored in African-American studies, American studies, and Spanish language and culture. And I received my master's degree from the University of Chicago School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. And since coming to Chicago about 6 years ago, I've been working in the fields of reentry, public defense support, and policy, criminal legal system policy change. And so I've had the privilege of collaborating with folks at Access Living, specifically around incorporating a disability lens and an understanding of the intersection of disability and the criminal legal system to work that we've done on the Pretrial Fairness Act, which is set to end money bond in Illinois pending a Supreme Court decision, and will dramatically reduce the number of people that are incarcerated pretrial in our state, which we think will disproportionately benefit people with disabilities, since people with disabilities are disproportionately incarcerated. So I'm glad to be here.
Great, thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alexander Brown. Pronouns are he, him. I'm a advisory council member for Access Living for the Diversion and Reentry program. I'm also on a fellowship for the Cook County Government Fellowship Program. I'm an intern with Community Green Legal Aid. I started off on the criminal relief side, working on expungements and seals. Now I'm on the policy side. I'm also a part of the Illinois Prison Project, and we focus on telling our stories when it comes to talking to policymakers about affecting change. When I think about public safety and when it comes to my work, I think about the reentry side of things, because I don't think a lot of people understand when it comes to reenter society, they don't understand what people go through as far as going through the incarceral system, how they're affected. You know, the carceral system is made to reprogram people and try to rehabilitate them, but that's not actually what the system does. It causes more harm than it does good. So when they reenter society, it's my job to help them have a successful reentry, because if I'm not a part of that success, then that harms public safety. When people are reentering society and they don't feel like they have anything to do, they don't have any hope, they go back to producing those harms on our world, on our society. And I think that's one thing that our carceral system fails. Me, myself, having lived experience going through the incarceral system, I've seen many people go inside of the prisons and they come in with more ideas of creating crime than they had once before they was even inside of the system. So I kind of understand like how the system works. And it's very important that when guys are brought back into society, that they have resources, they have a way to change, they have some hope, they have, and then once they become those productive citizens, they become a part of that public safety component. We look at recidivism that is very high. We look at people that are coming in and out of the system daily. So is the system really working for what they say it's supposed to work, or is it working for what we may assume for what it's intended to do? And that's harm people. And if you harm people going through the system, you have to realize that those people will be put back into society. If you're putting harm people back into society, then that reduces the possibility of having good public safety. And then when I look at it on a policy side, because I do work with a lot of policy organizations like Fully Free and Live Free, we have to think about people with lived experiences. We need to get out of the state of always having to ask for public safety, always having to ask for things that we need. We need to be the people with lived experience needs to be the ones that's making the decisions. We need to be involved. We need to be the lawmakers. We need the people making decisions. We need to be the people that's handing out the funding to programs that want to help people. We need to be the people at the top of the chain instead of always asking people and explaining to them what our problems are. Instead of explaining what our problems are, we need to have people with lived experiences in these positions to actually make change.
Hey, thank you so much, Alexander. And Omar, if you can do a quick intro and share your definition of public safety.
Sure thing. Thank you, Chris, again for inviting me to share with y'all today. I'm actually excited to learn more than I am to speak. And I'm sorry I couldn't be with y'all, the other two panelists. I was looking forward to meeting y'all today, but my children would not let me leave this morning. So I'm happy to be able to join you all virtually. Thankfully, we have that option. Dr. Obari Cartman, my background is clinical and community psychology. The current president of the Chicago Association of Black Psychologists. I met him a while ago, but I believe one of the things that he wanted me to speak to is about creating community access for mental health services. He spoke about the shortage of providers. We're in a really robust moment of people being more open to going to therapy and reconsidering what therapy looks like, and have not done as good a job in the field that I represent in creating this workforce, tapping into people with lived experiences to become some trained peer experts in facilitating circles and those kind of things. So I also spend a lot of time trying to integrate art, culture, movement, do a lot of drums, hip hop, those kind of sort of cultural expressive therapies into the therapeutic space for accessibility. And a lot of my focus is on Black men and boys. I work a couple days a week in incarcerated spaces, mostly with young people, youth prisons, and juvenile detention centers. And what Brother Alexander said is so important. Seeing it firsthand, sort of on the other side of it, as a service provider, as a community partner in incarcerated spaces. I had a really tough assignment yesterday in one of the centers I work in. I won't name it because I don't know who's on the call. But they asked me to provide some detailed evidence-based support for some of the curriculums that I'm bringing into the young people there. And I had to start with, in this report that they were asking me to produce, the lack of evidence that incarcerated spaces have for doing the work that they're supposed to be doing. Part of what he's speaking to is that it's easier to provide evidence that incarcerated systems are not working, are ineffective, and in fact are causing harm and are part of the institutions that create more damage in communities, that create less safety in communities. But the onus is always on the communities and the interventions and the mental health services and the social workers to prove that what we're doing is effective when we are clear that what exists is not effective. And so I share the first panelist's sentiments around public safety not being a reaction to violence. Stopping the violence is a minimum requirement. It's a small sort of expectation. I believe in safety, meaning that everyone has what they need. I believe safety includes people having the space and the resources to extend kindness to each other, to have compassion and grace, to have joy and peace of mind, and to be able to tap into those gifts that we are here to share and express and use to create and build sort of communities that are full of joy, where children are safe, where, the most vulnerable of us have everything that they need, that the people that are creating the conditions of harm are seen as a threat as much as the young people who might be inflicting interpersonal violence against each other and being penalized for it. I think we need a very much reconsideration of what is fair, what is meaningful, what is just, and for those things to be structured differently, so that communities can be internally safe, emotionally safe, spiritually safe, like all those sort of dynamic ways of being require completely different structure of economy, commerce, politics, socialization, education. So I believe in a radical readjustment of societies towards an essential understanding of everyone needing to be able to be and to be safely.
Well, thank you. Absolutely. I think all of you brought out some really interesting points about, the conversation around defining public safety, everything from the real simple yet really valuable sense of safety. Public safety is about safety, safe from harm, the feeling that we all have the right to pursue happiness and joy and comfort away from harm, as well as the idea of safety. To advocate for it is to it is an activity, it is an action of speaking up, advocating, making sure that our communities have the supports policy wise, as well as our own individual community speaking up to really push for what is safety for us, what is safety for our communities, and to keep having those conversations like we're having today. So thank you all for sharing your definitions, and kind of related to that, and kind of framing public safety in the sense of our disabled community. What do you think? Um, what does public safety require for people with disabilities?
I wouldn't say it requires anything separately or distinctive, right? Because all people should be treated equally. If the people who were setting out to serve on what public safety is actually supposed to do, it should just be people that's empathy for people. So you would treat all people good. You would, approach all situations with the right idea. I heard a story of an individual just trying to get on a bus, and the bus driver wouldn't even lower the bus so the person could get on, right? So I think when we think about public safety, it's the people, right? I think we have gotten so far from just like, even when you're driving down the street, I'm pretty sure we all have been in a situation where a car tries to merge in, or you're trying to merge in and they won't let you in. Their speed up. People just don't have empathy anymore. So I think it's just a wide range of just being just nice to people, being nice to one another. And as I work in this space, and as I just completed my organizing training with Access Living, I realized that when we talk about reentry and public safety, that disabilities is not in the conversation. Even when we just had our newly elected district council members, disabilities was not in the conversation. Isa and I were just talking with Chris earlier about community supports for people and organizations and communities. Disabilities is not in a conversation, but it's very important. I've seen a lot of situations where police may arrive on the scene and it could be somebody in a wheelchair. The police doesn't care. They'll throw you out of the wheelchair, or even if you're in prison, a person with a disability, you could be on crutches. The guards will throw away your crutches. They don't care. So I think it's going to come down to training. It's going to come down to some policies. It's going to come down to people having empathy. It's going to come down to a lot of work by a lot of groups of people simultaneously work for just change for a lot of different things.
Thank you.
Can I jump in?
Yes. Oh, yes, please, please.
Great. I think that Alexander, your point about equality is definitely well taken. Though I also do think that when it comes to equity, it does require at times a specified response to certain groups. in communities because everyone's needs are not the same. And I think that when we treat everybody's needs like they're the same, then you inherently can't meet people's needs, you know? And so when it comes to disability, I think one of the biggest things, and Amber is one of the first people that introduced me to this notion that, you know, disability is really less about what, you know, a person is not able to do for themselves, and more about the fact that our society is not set up to be responsive or accommodating to people's different abilities, at least certain different abilities, because there's certain difference in abilities that are just normalized across our society to the point where it's not even considered disability, and we accommodate for those things. But in other ways, there is an assumption that everyone's approaching every situation with the same abilities. And I think that comes up a lot in the criminal legal system when there is, so I think two things, criminalization in and of itself is very ableist because it is assuming that people have to be able to abide by certain behavior all the time in order to be considered a safe and valuable member of society. And while, of course, having boundaries around what we will accept in terms of how we treat each other is important, when you immediately criminalize someone because they don't live up to those in every single moment, you're ignoring mental illness, you're ignoring sometimes like social differences in people's ability to relate socially. And so criminalization in and of itself, sometimes the rules themselves that we're even dealing with are ableist in their assumption that everybody can abide by the same behavior all the time. And so, like, using even a personal example, I recently this year was diagnosed with ADHD. And for all of my life, I didn't even know that that was something that I was dealing with. But once I learned it, it put a lot of things into perspective, and it helped me to understand some behaviors and challenges that I didn't understand previously. And one of the things that ADHD can affect is emotional regulation. And so it can affect your ability to control your emotions and filter how you're reacting to situations that are frustrating. It can lower your frustration tolerance. So what might frustrate somebody and produce a more measured reaction might frustrate me and produce a more extreme reaction. And I'm generally a pretty even-tempered person, but especially some things that I've been dealing with over the last year or so had me in a space where it was even more difficult for me to regulate. And so I remember being on a plane and being asked, this is kind of an example of, I kind of felt criminalized by the rules because I was on a plane and the flight attendant was asking me if I was able to help in a situation of an emergency because I was sitting in the exit row. And I think, what's the assumption? Everybody knows, you just say yes to that question, you move on. But that particular day, I think another thing, when you think about how people process things differently, I'm a very literal person. So in that moment, I think I was just like, but wait, what am I actually agreeing to? And like, can I actually do whatever it is that they're asking me? So I just was asking for clarification. I was like, what do you mean, can I help in an emergency? Like, what does that look like? And all I was doing was seeking understanding, but she refused to answer my question. And the more that I reiterated my question, I was treated as if I was being like non-compliant, like as if I was being a problem because I wasn't just like processing the information the way that she thought I should process the information, or I didn't have the immediate understanding that she thought I should have. And she eventually asked me to just like move my seat altogether because she's like, I can't deal with somebody like this if something does happen. And I'm like, I could have been perfectly capable to help out in this situation. I just needed you to explain what that looked like. But there was an assumption of my ability. And there was an assumption that if I wasn't showing a certain amount of ability, it was because of my choice. It was because I wanted to be defiant instead of, this is just how I'm processing this situation right now. And she ended up kind of forcing me to move my seat. And it was kind of a humiliating situation. And I swore at her in the process. I was dysregulated and I swore at her. Come to find out, that's considered verbal assault of a flight attendant. And I got kicked off the plane. And I was just like, dang, this is crazy. I was going to my best friend's bridal shower. I was like, am I going to miss the bridal shower? You know what I mean? And it's just like, that was, you know, the same month that I got my ADHD diagnosis. So I understood it through a totally different lens than I would have previously. And I'm like, wow, this feels like the criminalization of disability. Like, this feels like I wasn't able to emotionally regulate, process the way she wanted, express myself the way she wanted. And because of that, I was seen as a threat instead of somebody trying to understand where I was coming from, understand how I was experiencing it, and relate in a way that was restorative rather than just you like the criminal legal system wants to identify the problem and eject it, as though we can just eject people from our society. And I think that that's when it comes to, you know, disability, it's like, how can we include people, not criminalize them, and not assume that everyone's approaching any situation with the same ability to comply.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Brianna, for sharing that. And it's interesting. It's like examples like that outside of a disability context, it was a perfectly reasonable request. Help me understand what the role is. I think anybody would have, it's a reasonable request coming from anybody who is not that familiar. And, you know, the poor response from the flight attendant, whether it be a flight attendant or outside of that situation, any person who just kind of doesn't take that question is an example of either people's biases or their own, I guess, accountability of not providing adequate information, and layering on top of being a person with a disability. And if that person has that sense, oh, this person has a disability, and all the stigma associated with it, just again, as you were sharing, just kind of layers on an additional sense of, why are you attacking me and making the situation unsafe or unhealthy? And I think it goes, again, kind of ties into the larger conversation of today about what, and we'll talk about some of the question a bit later about what things can be done and what things organizations and groups can do. Keep in mind to be more cognizant of public safety policies and procedures for our disabled community. And I wanted to also make time for Obari, if you wanted to, if you had your thoughts and perspectives on this question of what does public safety require from us as a disabled community, or not, as was mentioned earlier.
I mean, I have more questions than I have answers, as I'm thinking about sort of what this all means from a wellness perspective. I do know that one of the things that I appreciate about the equity lens and having to think more about the needs of people who have a different experience than me, that in conversation, I always learn more when I'm in a more diverse sort of community. The more different people I meet, the more I learn about what people need, and from a variety of lenses. And not necessarily even like in a disability lens, but like just people need different things. People are different. We're very unique. We have different needs at different times. And I think that the more we have conversations and develop better listening and consideration for each other, I think that it allows us to create spaces, interactions, events that accommodate to people's needs. And I think that's a very simple human thing to do. Just wonder what people need and how can I give them that? And certainly to Brianna's point, if some people need more, and if we care about that, then we would do that more, right? So I think it's a very simple idea. But at the root of this question of, she spoke about compliance even, I think there's a larger question that I wrestle with often about, like, who even has the moral authority to decide, right? How did America earn the right to judge, right? Who has the power, the authority to make a diagnosis about ability or not, mental, physical, otherwise? And the question for me is like, ability to do what? In the mental health world, a lot of our diagnoses are rooted in how able someone is to function in society. So if you're sad, that's a normal reaction. But if you're so sad that it becomes depressed, that it's prolonged, that you're unable to function at work or at school, then you get diagnosed with a major depressive disorder. But the center of it is this idea of being able to function in a society, to be a more effective cog in a wheel, to be able to produce. And so it's really about ability to produce, right? Wellness, to be able to fit within a capitalistic system of keeping the order, And some of that just feels very uncomfortable to me, just because of the authority we give, the hierarchy we allow to have someone else have the power to define what is disordered and what is not, which leaves those people who I would consider to be a disordered pathology to have a desire to dominate, right? We call it white supremacy. I call it white pathology. There's something sick about traveling the world and seeing someone having the desire to dominate, to control, and to inflict violence, and then to sit back and watch it play out. That's a sickness to me, right? But we've normalized it so much. We fit in it. We have to adapt to it without diagnosing that as dysfunctional in the ecosystems of the people, the planet, and everything else that is impacted by sort of that sense of a pathology. And so when I think about that at the center of this, that question of ability to do what, it's really ability to go along, right? It's the mental, physical, spiritual ability to just fit within something that we don't allow ourselves to question at the root of it, whether or not that thing we're trying to fit into, that we're trying to be able to coincide with is a good thing, is a healthy thing. And I think those kind of questions, again, leave me with more like, then what? Like, what should it look like? What does it mean to create societies where people have what they need and are not just trying to fit within something that we were born into and don't even have the space, the room to rest and to be able to have the imagination to question it. We're so busy with the to-do list, with the rigmarole, with the rat race, the hamster wheel. Like we're just stuck. And then just it becomes a reaction again to if I'm not doing that well, if I'm not functioning properly, if I'm not able to comply, then I get labeled with a variety of sort of notions of labels of disabilities, ADHD or physical or otherwise. But you know, I have children. My children are small. I got 7 and 10. I wanted to turn 11 a couple days ago, and so I'm very careful about, particularly they're Black boys, the overdiagnosing of Black boys with ADHD, because there's an individual analysis that says if they can't fit within the structure, if they can't sit down, pay attention, follow rules, if they can't comply long enough, then they have disrupted the structure of the society that they've created in that school, in the classroom. But I always ask first, is that the right structure? Should they be moving more? Should everybody be moving more? Should they be playing more? Is it not developmentally appropriate to ask them to sit still and to regurgitate? Is there something about the structure of the classroom that's broken and not the individual boy that needs to learn how to pay closer attention to this misaligned structure? And so I think those questions, again, give us broader room to think more about like, what are we trying to be able to do? And what is the function of trying to fit into a thing that may be broken in itself? I'm
No,
not sure
absolutely.
where I take us, but you know, those are
No, I thank you so much for those. And I think, you know, in conversations around and discussions around public safety and I think, you know, as time moves on, definitions, language, public safety policies and definitions, all of those as a society, as a community, as people over time, as we evolve, so does definitions and ideas and practices. And I think that's something that we have to kind of acknowledge and questions and ideas that help push us to think and analyze and to be and to reflect, I think is really important in all of this. And as we were as you know we were talking and you were all responding to the question of what does public safety require from our disabled community, I was thinking maybe we should ask the reverse question of, as a disabled community, what should we as a disabled community require from public safety, and what does that mean? And I know it wasn't a prepared question, but if it's all right with you, I'd like you to if it's to take a crack at it and think if from our disabled community perspective, what do we require public safety to be?
Let's let Dr. Barry take it. He was in a deep thought. Let's let this brother finish sharing his thoughts.
No. Y'all got it. We can take turns. I'm not even sure if I could understand the question well.
I think he was just flipping the question on his head, like he was saying,
Mhm.
you know, I think initially the question was something like, what does public safety require for people with disabilities? And he's saying, what does the community of people with disabilities require public safety to be? What do we require from a system that's designed around public safety? Am I understanding that right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
From
I
your
think,
experiences and perspectives, what is public safety? What do we what does the disabled community require public safety or from public safety?
yeah, I think one thing that has been coming to mind for me is that we require safety from the system. And I don't think people think about that. You know, people think about, well, how do we provide safety to the rest of society? Strong air quotes there, from the people who are deemed to be a threat. But what about the fact that this entire prison industrial complex apparatus is a threat to individual people's safety, Black people's safety, disabled people's safety, poor people's safety, and in turn, everybody's safety, because none of us are safe if all of us are not safe. And if we have a system of this magnitude that is able to repeatedly traumatize such a large swath of our community, it's impossible for us to not all be touched by the harm and the ripple effects of that. And so I think when we talk about what is public, like what we require, I think is we require safety from the system. There has to be accountability that the system is a mechanism that causes harm. And not only that causes harm, but something that came to my mind is that it's a disabling system. So it doesn't only label disability, it doesn't only criminalize disability, it doesn't only punish disability, but it produces disability. I remember watching one of Access Living's webinars on reentry, and they had people speaking who had been incarcerated, even only pretrial. People often refer to pretrial incarceration as detention, but it's full-blown incarceration. And then some people say that it's worse than prison. But you know, there were people that went into jail without any ailments and came out with ailments because of the treatment that they received, because of not being given health care, because of being treated like animals, because of poor air quality, because of torturous conditions that deteriorate people's mental health. And so what does the community require from the system of public safety? Well, it requires for it to not be a disability inflicting institution as a place to start, I would think.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for that thought. That's a really that's a really important perspective and notion.
I will add to that. That
Just
is
to
really
be involved in the conversation, you know, to be in the room when decisions are being made. And piggybacking on what she said, as far as my disability evolved when I was in prison. And so I had to advocate and fight just for adequate medical care. And just even going through that process, it was a joke because the process doesn't work. You know, I had to file through certain levels, and my grief would get returned because I didn't have enough copies. They wanted 4 copies, I submitted 3. So now you have to wait 6 months for that system to go around, but you only have 12 months to complete the whole system. So just certain delays can restart you. And when we were talking about our health and, you know, living with a disability, and you may need crutches and you have to fight for that. You have to go through a 12-month system just to even get there. And you still won't get it at the end because they have so many barriers to deter you from even want to go through the process. So one of my biggest things is people with lived experience. We need to be a part of the process. We need to be a part of the conversation. We need to be a part of, you know, making the decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you.
no. I love that thread of thought of thinking about ways in which the system as it exists creates disability. It's a harmful system, and then it creates the disability and then punishes the disability. It's really sick, you know what I'm saying, cycle. And I'm extending sort of this notion of the incarcerated systems itself causing harm to particularly young people. Most of the young people I'm talking to in those systems range from 13 to 18, maybe 19. And one of the things that we struggle in there with is the cycles of violence that they inherited, and try to give them some sense of ability to disrupt. By the time we talk after a while, they're pretty clear that there was a setup. They struggle with the personal responsibility for making a decision to get them in there versus being born in a zip code that had been disinvested, that gave them a limited amount of decisions to make. And I get to really harp, particularly in those sessions, on them being children their whole lives. Like they're just right at the edge, some of them, of transferring into what we would consider adulthood, but they've been children the whole time. And when I think about sort of this notion that a system creates disability, beyond just happening to begin once they meet an incarcerated system, we can really think back to like prenatal, right? We can think about the conditions in which certain mothers don't have adequate health care, don't have adequate options for education once the baby daycare, don't have support systems and families, that those things are crippling, right? And I use that word deliberately. There's a crippling impact of the systemic sort of poverty, disinvestment that, again, is so sick that gets criminalized later in life, but starts so young, right? Starts before a person is born. And when I'm in incarcerated spaces with young people, they're very clear to see that there's a system that set them up to fail, that failed for okie doke. But then when I try to challenge them to consider what would it mean for you to create a different opportunity for your children before they're born, they have a hard time with that. They can clearly see that a system set me up. So before I was born, a young person could say, someone set me up to be here. And then I could say, well, what about your children? Will they be here too? No, also, I asked, were your fathers here? And half of the room, yeah, my father's was here. And now I'm here. And then we're trying to extend that. So are your children going to be here? How do we prevent that? They often have a hard time saying, no, I can't do nothing about that. Right. So there's a powerlessness, a hopelessness that is also crippling, that creates this intergenerational trauma that cycles, that um, if we don't find systemic, I think we're leaning towards some of the policy things that are happening. But before we even get to policy, so part of what I hear the question to be is, what can we do as communities to have conversations, to connect? I'm meeting most of y'all for the first time ever, right? What does it mean for us to build our own community level infrastructure where we can provide our own needs, so that we don't have to be as dependent on systems and wait for policies to change, but we can really, from the ground up, create the community level of power to give ourselves those needs, to battle against the crippling effects of a system that we know has designed for certain people to win and most of us to fail, particularly Black and Brown. But I think there's a responsibility that we have, and just, all of us in our differing abilities, to have a little bit more of urgency around connecting and creating institutions, community levels, informal grassroots levels, so that we can provide the needs to be a bit of a buffer, I think. In the meanwhile, while we're changing large systems, I think we can create smaller systems where we can do some of the things where we provide the needs that we know we need, which include very, very simple things like fruits and vegetables, like art and music, like kindness and space to play. I mean, I think that we can provide some of those things for ourselves. And I think, some of that responsibility is ours.
Absolutely. Thank you all for indulging in this question, and for your really insightful thoughts and questions and ideas for us to think about in terms of what public safety, what we from the disability community should require public safety to be. And I think everything that you shared around the ideas, again, around speaking up, around challenging and acknowledging that the system itself is flawed and has and can and has caused disabilities or is harmful, and thoughts of addressing it. You know, so we've had a conversation around defining public safety and expectations around it. There's a question asking you all to reflect on what are some of the major significant or big barriers facing people with disabilities, specifically people with disabilities of color, from a public safety standpoint. And I'm going to ask if you all could like maybe highlight one or two, and then I want to move on to spend the last few minutes of our time now talking about some ideas of ways that we as individuals, as a community, and what we can ask our policymakers and things to start addressing some of these barriers and make public safety, for lack of a better term, just better. So can you all highlight any, like, what is like one or two biggest barriers from your perspective or from your work facing people with disabilities of color from a public safety standpoint?
This is Brianna speaking, just for interpretation. At the risk of stating the obvious, I would say that the biggest barrier facing people of color with disabilities in terms of public safety is racism. It's the obvious thing to say, but it's honestly the biggest barrier, because racism is the reason that we're trying to carve out and imagine safety in a system that literally was not designed for the safety of Black people and non-white people. The system was designed to protect white wealth, white power. So it bends itself in that direction. All of the criminalization, the vast majority of the criminalization is aimed towards BIPOC communities. The vast majority of the punishment is aimed towards BIPOC communities. I'm doing a project at work on on prosecutors' offices that are, trying to be progressive. And in one office, they were trying to use data to assess racial disparities in their work. And one of the things they were trying to ask themselves is, are we treating white children in the juvenile legal system similar to Black children in the juvenile legal system? And they couldn't even assess that question because white children are not in the juvenile legal system. And is that because they don't do any of the things that Black kids do that gets criminalized and used to drag them into the system? Absolutely not. They just don't get sent there because that it was not the response that was made for them. The juvenile legal system was made to kill a Black child, to punish a Black child. It wasn't made for them. And so the biggest barrier to public safety in this system is the fact that the system is not created to give safety to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And as long as we're not able to acknowledge and address that, it's often a maddening conversation because you're talking around the core of the reality. You're talking around the racism. You're talking around the discrimination. Even Alexander, when you mentioned training can maybe help some well-intentioned people, but you can't train away racism. You may be able to train away some unintentional bias, but how do you train away hatred? How do you train away the fact that you look at somebody and you don't see them as a human? So you're willing to take their crutches and throw them on the ground and leave them unable to walk, or you're willing to look at somebody who's in a mental health crisis, but because you don't value their life like you value your sister or your brother's life, you're willing to throw them in the back of a police car and carry them away to be put in a cage instead of to get some help. I'm not going to say there's not a fix for that, but we are hard pressed to find the type of solutions that the system requires, because the system wants order and, things that are digestible and things that are reasonable to fix a system that is brutal, that is chaotic, that is ravaging. And so as long as we're trying to fight fire, this chaotic wildfire that is the prison industrial complex and racial capitalism, with these measured little kind of cups of water that are palatable to people in power, this is literally going to be a fight until this world ends.
Thank you so much. That's very real, and I think it's as much as I think all of us understand that reality. I think it is important, and many of us, depending on who we are or where we are, sometimes feel fatigued addressing it and always bringing up the reality of racism and or ableism. It is important to say it and to acknowledge it and to push people and ourselves to find ways of addressing it, um, to the best of our ability. So thank you for sharing that. Um, Alexander Obara, do you have what are your thoughts in terms of any other big challenges facing disabled people of color in public safety?
I just echo what she said. She nailed it with a coffin. We're dealing with a society that's not fair when it comes to equality. Just being fair on all boards all around. I also think that one barrier that we also have that's lacking it and that's necessary is just community organizations that's focused to have supports of people with disabilities more in our communities. I can't really think of any. If I think about the South Side or the West Side of Chicago, and I've worked on both sides of towns, and I'm not saying that they don't exist. I'm just saying that I don't know about them. A lot of times we have a lot of resources in our communities that we're not even aware of. So I would just like to see more efforts on those resources becoming available. And I forgot to announce, this is Alex speaking.
Thank you, Alex.
This is Obari speaking. I definitely echo the sentiments of Brianna around racism being the identifiable problem. I would add to it though, that there's a relationship where there is a group of people, right, a small minority of wealthy, powerful resources, people that are hoarding, that are greedy, that are pathological, that are violent, that have created a notion to say that certain people are less than, and created infrastructure and reinforced that infrastructure through violence. That is certainly a racist system. At the same time, I want to point to the other side of that where in the mostly Black people who I'm working with in communities, there's a sense of ownership, of internalizing, of being injected with those ideas that turn into a different problem. So it'd be one thing for someone to say, you are less than. It's a different thing for me to receive that and then apply that and then operate as if that is the truth, right? So part of what I'm trying to identify specifically is a lack of worthiness, a self-deprecating deficiency, a sense that on top of the disability, whether it's bipolar or ADHD, or it's a physical disability, or it's autism, well, I already have something where I'm not functioning in the same way that my peers are. But now on top of that, as a Black person and other sort of communities of color, now I have to wrestle with this internalized sense that as a child, from the whole time, I've also been taught that I'm not as good as, just because of who I am, right? So then there's a double, you know what I mean? There's a intersection of an internalization of that racism that is a separate thing from the racism itself that causes a litany of other problems. So I think that's something that we can find a unique medicine for that does not require immediate shifting. Brianna said, we're going to be fighting this fight to the world ends. And that I believe in that. I believe there will always be sort of combats between systems of power and people that are trying to control and maintain that power. I think at the same time within that, while that is happening, that we can do more, better, have a specific sort of targeted efforts to make sure that while that's happening, we don't have children feel like they are less than, regardless of what a system or what other people have said, regardless of what the media machine has put out, regardless of the images of, what it means to be African. I grew up thinking about sort of this mixed message. In my house, we were celebrating Kwanzaa and playing drums, but I was also watching TV where Tom and Jerry had the cannibals eating each other with the bones in their noses. And so then there's a disconnection from, see, I hear a lot of Black people saying, I don't want to watch those slave movies no more because we're tired of this sense of shame of who we are at our core. So there's an identity piece that is on top of the function, on top of the ability that I believe that we can do more of through education and conversation to give a sense of worthiness, belongingness, that's racial, that's cultural, that's different than just solving like anxiety or depression, but it's different than just maintaining and functioning. It's something at its core that allows people to see themselves as their beingness being whole and complete, regardless of racism. Right. And we understand the impact that racism has done to do that. I know the power of the media to create a sense that I'm not as good as. And then we have responses where Black Lives Matter or I am somebody or I am a man. We're trying to beg to be seen as worthy. But that's an outward expression. That's a relationship between sort of these two opposing groups. They don't have to be, right? We can also try to find within ourselves how to restore self, how to restore community, how to give ourselves a platform to say that we are Black, beautiful, proud, that my Africanness is a badge of honor, not dishonor, that I'm not ashamed of who I am, that the reasons that these communities on the South and West Side look like this are not because I am inherently deficient, but that of something has happened to us, and to give people a sense of that understanding, and then to create activities where we are reconnecting to those traditional practices, the drums and the dance and the language and the things that were taken from us. And we were demonized through sort of a very vicious process of convincing us that we are not connected to anything valuable. I think that's a separate problem than racism. That's something that a lot of my work attempts to create remedies for.
Thank you all for sharing your insights around everything. So far this morning, we've talked about public safety definitions, the challenges, and some of the core big challenges that kind of weave through, whether it's racism, ableism, the whole idea of systemic oppressive systems um, as one of the bigger challenges, as well as resources, community organizing. Now, as we've talked a lot about those ideas of public safety, and I want to redirect a little bit about what can be done to start addressing public safety or helping to shape it. So one, from like a community organizing or community organization or nonprofit or private organization groups, whether it be a group, a nonprofit organization, what and those groups connected to the disability community, what type of activities or things do you think that is important for those groups or organizations to do to be more inclusive of public safety for people with disabilities?
You said just only what is required of community organizations to be inclusive of people with disabilities?
Yeah, for this question, let's focus on community organizations, community groups.
So I guess the question is, because I can barely hear you, but how can community organizations help the communities? I mean, how can organizations help the communities when it comes to disabilities?
And how can they be more inclusive?
Yeah, so, sorry about my volume. Yeah, the question was, as a community organization or community group, what can they do to help support public safety, advocate for it, shape it, promote it, kind of as a big umbrella?
It's going to be how, community organizations will define public safety. I think it's going to be a lot of conversations is going to be needed with the communities and how our communities see public safety. What are their concerns? What are their needs? It's definitely going to be a community efforts and community conversations, and what are the barriers that they're facing? Is it out of the barriers against the police department, out of the barriers dealing with the criminal justice system, out of the barriers dealing with resources, out of the barriers dealing with feeling like they don't have any access to resources when it comes to disabilities. So when it comes to public safety, when I think about it, it's an array of things that we're going to need when it comes to solving that issue, because there's so many things that affects public safety. If we're talking about, like I spoke before, if we're talking about coming from an incarceral setting, you have people coming from prison that's not being rehabilitated properly. You have people in the community that probably haven't even dealt with the incarceral system, that are dealing with disabilities that, may have them feeling that they don't have hope. So I think it's just the mindsets of the people in the community that there's going to be a lot of conversations that we're going to need to pretty much understand what their needs are, and just work on effecting that change. And it's definitely going to be a big effort of all the community members.
Thank you, Alexander.
This is Brianna speaking. When it comes to community-based organizations advocating for the well-being of people with disabilities, I think it starts with making sure that internally there is a culture of inclusion and embrace. Again, we're operating in a system that imputes inferiority to anybody that doesn't function according to the desires and demands of a racialized capitalist system. So yeah, I think that there has to be internally, there has to be embrace. And so at the organizational level, making sure that that you don't require for somebody to participate in your organization, that they have to function only according to the way that ableist standards require, and making sure that you're able to meet people where they are, maximize on their strengths. I really liked what you said about Dr. Obari about how there's an over-reliance on pathologizing. So even with the ADHD diagnosis, I will say for clarity that I've been diagnosed with ADHD, but you'll rarely hear me say that I have ADHD because it's labeled as a disorder. And from my understanding, being neurodiverse, there's a whole array of strengths that come with my neurodiversity as well as challenges. And so I feel like it's never accurate to solely label it as a disorder. So I think when people who are differently able come to your organizations, making sure that you're not just seeing them as someone that needs to be accommodated, but as somebody who has something extraordinary to offer in the areas that their abilities differ from others. And making sure that there's actually an organizational investment in accommodating people, because for this event, there had to be an investment in ASL. There had to be an investment in making sure that different elements of the event were accessible. Same thing with any organization that wants to include and advocate for people with disabilities. You have to make sure that you're able to invest in it. And I know that that can be hard because sometimes our community organizations are not always well resourced. But understanding that it's a matter of necessity, not a luxury, and thinking about what things can be moved around to prioritize this, to make sure that people can be included. And then when it comes to advocacy to overcome the barriers that are facing people with disabilities, people of color with disabilities, I think there has to be an unapologetic willingness to call out the things that we've been talking about here. The racism in the system, the inherent ableism in the system, the fact that there is inherent flaws in the system that harm people of color, that harm people with disabilities, rather than we're just asking the system to extend its benevolent arm to help people with disabilities. That is not what it is that we're dealing with. We're actually dealing with harm reduction. And when it comes to the things that we actually advocate for, I think that we can't only advocate for the system to become more accommodating. I think we have to advocate for the system to become less involved, specifically the criminal legal system, to just become less involved, because there's just inherent harm that comes with a system that is created to criminalize and to incapacitate and to punish. And so what are we doing to not just advocate for the change of that system, but advocate for off-ramps? That's one of the biggest things we did with the Pretrial Fairness Act, was like, how can we find off-ramps for people to not even be funneled into that system to begin with and advocate for the building up of community-based supports and the deflection, diversion, redirection to those other more safe community-based resources.
Great, thank you. No, thank you. Thank you so much for that input. And I hate to push us forward just for time. I wanted to finish up with this last question of, because public safety, a large part of public safety is connected to policy, legislation, our local, city, state, and government officials, as well as funders, private, public funders to fund programs. And I think it is important in a conversation around public safety to ask the question, what is important, or what do we need to ask and push our government leaders, legislators, policymakers, and our funders so that public safety is prioritized, is important, is being supported in the direction that is important and meaningful for us, the disabled community of color, as we've been talking about today. So for our last question, if you all could share ideas on what we need to ask, advocate, push our policymakers, government leaders to think about to support public safety for us.
I'm going to respond to both those questions at the same time. Starting with one of the reasons I was excited about coming to this gathering, and I'm going to stick around and listen in, is because I have a lot of learning to do around policy. I don't sort of work in that arena. My brain doesn't think in that way. And I'm, very close to the ground. I like to do community level things. I like to be with people. And as soon as you start talking policy, I get bored. I get a little discouraged. I don't like working with systems in that kind of way. I have analysis of them, but I don't have a lot of practice intervening at that level. But Chris mentioned a bill, legislation that I'm not even familiar with, right? That I want to learn more about when he was talking about developing the workforce. And so part of it is acknowledging, I think, all of our shortcomings, our strengths, and areas of growth. And for me, this is one of them. And part of what I think that I'm trying to speak to in this response is people recognizing their strengths and learning the value of community so that we can have a sort of a diverse coalition. I'm big on like communities working together. Everything we're talking about did not happen because of any one organization or group. The systems collaborated to create this mess that we're in. So it's going to require us to work together to get ourselves out of it. And for me, as a person who does a lot of events, I'm learning a lot today around how do you create events that are more inclusive and accessible. The vice president of our organization, Black Psychologists, is in a wheelchair. And so she reminds me often about going to spaces, finding locations, making sure that it's accessible to her. And so part of what I'm asking for all of us is to have some patience with each other. A lot of the reasons things are created that are not inclusive or accessible is because of obliviousness. People just don't know. I'll say myself, there's things I just don't know. Had not considered, had not thought of, because my world is my world, and we all sort of busy and working and stressed and all those things. And sometimes, it's important for us to just check each other, pull each other to the side and say, that was cool. Next time it would be easier for me to hear if, right? Those kind of things can be done with compassion and patience and kindness still. But I think that we need to be in more often communication. I need to come to more events where there are people that have interpreters, so I can meet them and hire them for the things that we're doing. We need to write that into our grants. The organization needs to prioritize that and not just say, well, they're not there because I don't see them. But the reason that they're not there is because we have not created a space for diverse people to be there. And that it really just has a lot to do with ignorance, not because we don't care, right? Not because oftentimes just did not know what would have made an event or an occasion more accessible to more people. So we just need to talk and we need to listen. And then we need to turn that information that we get into practical sort of changes in the way we create spaces to have meetings and things that, again, I wouldn't think of because I'm trying to hurry up and get through stuff, right? But I learn every time I meet new people, but that requires those people to be open about what their needs are, and then me to respond. So I think we're just talking about relationships, listening, communication, opening those lines, and then that grows. And I think that it gives us a better position to be able to fight for the higher level policy shifts because we have more clarity and community building, sort of down below, if you will.
Thank you. Brianna?
Sure. When it comes to what to ask our policymaker, government leaders, funders, I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is just requiring that they fight unapologetically. I think that sometimes when it comes to systems change, there can be such a reticence to confront injustice, to call it out, and to make bold changes. And I think we have to require that they fight like it was their family on the line. You know, sometimes the people that are in leadership are a few too many steps removed from the realities of the things that they're legislating and making decisions around and how they're affecting people. And so requiring that they fight for us like they would fight for their own family and for their own children is one thing. The other thing that comes to mind is to require evidence and to listen to the evidence in a way that's different than what they have. So what I'm thinking about is the fact that we have a crisis in the way that our criminal legal system operates. But there is so much blowback and pushback when we talk about divesting from that system and investing in other systems as though it's just the wildest thing in the world. But I was looking at this interview for a work project that I'm on recently, and it was talking about how if we had airplanes that we were flying and they were all crashing all the time, we would not fly those airplanes anymore, and we would prioritize investing in building something different. We wouldn't just keep flying the same crashing airplanes. And I think that that's literally what we're doing with continuing to not only rely on the system at its current level, but whenever we see a spike in violence, we see a call to add back the mandatory minimums, add more policing, go back to the same strategies again and again. And it's like we're just keep on launching these failing airplanes and accepting the casualties as par for the course. But then when you try to suggest a different way to go, it's like, well, where's the evidence? Where's the data? Da, 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 da. And it's like, but what about all the evidence that this current thing is failing? And so when we talk about evidence-based and grants and policies, requiring that the same rigorous evidence that's often required to support community-based supportive alternatives needs to be used to challenge and undermine the system that has failed us so miserably and so brutally in many of these ways. So that's one thing that comes to mind for me.
Thank you, Brianna. Alexander.
So I'll be fast. This is Alex speaking. I would say the most important thing is for people to mobilize so their voice can be heard. Sometimes you'll be amazed at how by mobilizing your voice and politicians being receptive to certain issues because they're just ignorant to the fact of some of the things that we face. Sometimes they just don't know, and sometimes just allowing your voice to be heard makes them very receptive. And you'll be so happy just to be involved with getting that change done. So I've been involved with some policies where it took a little fight, but after a while, after that fight, they became so receptive and realized that it was so unjust that this harm existed in the first place that it should have never existed. And they quickly, gave us some relief. And I've been a part of some things that was going good and went bad and then went back good again. So I think the first thing we have to do is allow our voices to be heard, because if they don't know what's going on, then how can we get the change to even happen?
Beautiful. Jay, can you say a couple of words and then transition over to me so I can foreshadow the next session?
Absolutely. Thank you so much to Brianna, Alexander, and Obari. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Apologies to everyone for going a little bit long, but this was a really, really important and valuable conversation, which I think has a lot food for thought for the sessions that follow. So thank you everyone for joining us. It was my pleasure being your moderator, and I will turn it back over to Cliff.
Beautiful. Thank you all. I just want to say a few things about what I heard because it really touched me. It was just sort of like some of my key takeaways from that session was this idea of issues like racism, classism and other issues that often come up, like sexism that often divide us, is opportunities like with issues like ableism that affect us all to serve as another key component to the conversation that can help build a bridge, to talk about how these sort of historic systems of, life based on productivity, life based on ability to do something creates a thread across all of the different cultures and communities within our system, and how those sort of prejudices and discriminatory practices get codified into law and rooted and institutionalized and end up creating a sort of dysfunction and disorder structurally from the structure and the system itself that affects us all in a negative capacity. And if we can acknowledge that and look at the root causes of what kind of help perpetuates dysfunction and disorder, then we have a greater capacity to kind of better understand how we can work together to advance change and advance a better society for not just individual communities, but a better, broader life across all of our society. So thank you so much. So looking ahead to the next session, what we are going to be looking at is the importance of data collection and how can we use data to inform the supports and services that people need in order to provide the actual supports and services that they need. So there's a huge conversation that's growing around, like you said, evidence-based practices. So how can we use that data to kind of create the evidence of what we actually need? And, so with that said, thank you so much.